Okay, this brief video is based on the OCR GCSE Your Paper 2 paper, the source-based paper, and we're just going to do a brief video looking at how one might approach a comparison question. A comparison question is a question that asks you to compare two different sources, source A and source B. It might say, how similar are these two sources? Or how far do you agree that these two sources are similar? Anything along those lines. With that question, how similar? You're going to need to look at the ways in which they are similar and perhaps therefore some of the differences before concluding. So you take this apple here and the orange here, and you can have a think immediately about the ways in which they are similar, but also the ways in which they are different. And that's essentially what you're being asked to do with the two sources, similarities and differences. The question we're going to be looking at today is this one. It's taken from the specimen paper. It's worth 9 marks, so it's a hefty question. And it asks you, but it says very clearly which sources it wants you to look at, sources A and B, and the question there, as I say, is how similar are these two sources? How similar? Be wary of the way the question is asked. If the question, rather than how similar, was something more like, in what ways are these two sources similar? It's only asking you to look at the similarities. But because of this word here, because of this how similar, how far, it's asking you to look at both sides and make a judgment. The other thing to notice about the wording of the question, it says use the sources. That means they would expect to see maybe some quotations, even if it's just one word or two, but you need to be using the details from the sources. And critically, this is the thing that people forget, but as the mark scheme you will see, is absolutely essential, your knowledge to explain your answer. So these are the two sources. This is source A and source B. Now, if you've got this paper at home, brilliant, that'd be really useful. If not, you can find it on the OCR website. You can find the past paper there. It's down as the specimen paper. If not, you can simply pause the video and have a look on your screen. Now, in the exam, I would make sure that whenever you're looking at the sources, you're annotating, you're writing, you're scribbling all over them. Obviously, you can't do that if it's on a computer screen, but if you have got the questions in front of you, feel free to do that. Now, before you start looking through, have a word with yourself. What kind of things can you be looking for when you're comparing the two sources? You need to make sure that they are meaningful comparisons, that you're not just simply saying this uses different words from that one. We need to be thinking about, in what way are they, as sources of evidence, how are they different, or how similar are they? So here are some of the things that you could think about as you go through. You could think first of all about the purpose. What are they trying to achieve in these two sources? Are they similar, or do they have very different purposes? Now, linked to that will be the message. What are they saying? They might have the same purpose, they might be trying to achieve the same thing, but is their message perhaps different? Are they going about it in different ways? So this is really kind of what are they saying? If a source has a particular purpose, quite often that might affect the tone of the source. Now, when I use this word tone, what I'm talking about is the way that the language is used. Is it bitter? Is it angry? Is it calm? Is it formal? What tone do they use? Is this different between the two sources, or is this similar? You also will perhaps need to be able to think about the audience. Who is it being written for, or who is it being written to, which in turn may well affect the tone or the message that they're trying to put across. So have a think about who it's written to. You'll need to think about, obviously, perhaps should have started with this, who wrote it? Is that different? Is that similar? So, who wrote it? And also look at when did they write it? That's important. And finally, it's also important to think about just generally what is the nature of this source. Now, you'll have addressed that to some extent with these two, but what is it? Is it a magazine? Is it a newspaper? What type of source is it? And is that different? And how does that affect everything else? Okay, so here are some of the things that you could be thinking about. Now, no two sort questions will be the same. Some of this stuff won't be relevant for some questions, but it will be for others. So have these kind of things in mind as you start analysing the two sources. Okay. So here are the two sources. Pause the video, have a good read of them, and try to, if you've got the copy at home, annotate them and start thinking about what similarities and differences you've spotted. In addition to this, as you're thinking through it, also think really carefully about your contextual knowledge. What do you know about this period that's going to help you to explain those similarities and differences? Okay. So hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at them, have a read of them, and you will have some ideas. Now here are just a few ideas that I would pick out. I'm going to start with the similarities and try and work through the similarities. Now the most obvious similarity for me is that they are both campaigning for the vote. We want the vote here and for source A, and women need the vote in source B. So there's a similarity there, a very broad similarity in terms of their purpose. But in terms of the way they go about getting that purpose across, I guess their message, if you like, there are also some similarities there as well. For example, source A is talking a lot about rates of pay, law and regulations. It's talking about in the factory we are not represented, which you can also see in source B to some extent, where it talks about them being excluded from the better paid jobs in the civil service. So in both sources they're talking about the need for the vote, and they're talking about the fact that perhaps having the vote will lead to an improvement in women's positions economically. Now at this point you should be thinking, right, okay, I've got a point here that I can make. What about my contextual knowledge? And straight away you can think about the economic position of women at the start of the 20th century. We know that only 10% of married women were in work at this time. That's not particularly helpful, writing it like that, but 10% of married women were in work at this time. We also know, it talks about in the factory we're not represented, rates of pay. We also know that women made up the majority of people in the sweated trades, where working conditions were particularly poor. So you can make a general point about the similarities there, and referring to working conditions. So in a sense we've got the basis of a paragraph there. We've got the fact that they are similar. We've got some other general points about the injustice. It talks about it is unjust and bad for the country, and we've got similar points being made in the second source. So there are a number of similarities between the two sources, and you can put that into a paragraph. Remember, though, how important it is to keep your contextual knowledge in there. Then you'd need to move on to the other side and start looking at some of the differences that exist between the two sources. And while on the face of it they sound quite similar, actually if you look at it closely there are some considerable differences. Now the first thing is that in the nature of the two sources, one is a petition, one is a journal or a magazine. So they are different types of sources or pieces of evidence, and as a result they have slightly different aims. So this one is from a petition to Parliament, Okay, so petition to Parliament. So we think about their audience there. Um, and you might even notice this first bit, some 29,000 of us have signed this petition for you, our MPs. The tone here is quite respectful. It's because its purpose is to win over the MPs. Now, look at the date. This is 1901. This is before, and this is where we bring in our context, this is before the suffragettes, or the WSPU, was set up in 1903. So you might want to use that contextual knowledge to say, well, whereas the tone is quite respectful here, there's a different tone and a different aim with the second one. The second source isn't directed at Parliament. The second source is more general and perhaps trying to win over the public at large. Indeed, you can see that from the title here, or the start, where it says, "What is our campaign about?" It's trying to explain the campaign to the wider public rather than just purely to Parliament. So, here we have in source A, I think we have really quite a narrow piece of evidence from a group of workers in Lancashire cotton mills. They're particularly concerned with their own situation. They're writing it to Parliament. This is far broader. And that's perhaps, if you look at the date, perhaps because of the fact this is in 1913. Now, here again, bring in your contextual knowledge. You know that by 1913, the votes for women movement had expanded hugely. Membership had grown, but also so had their arguments, so had the scope of their arguments. And you can see here, it isn't just talking about the workplace. It's talking about laws on divorce, children and other issues. It's talking about housing. It's talking even about the purification of food. So I think the key thing is that source B is far broader, and you can use your contextual knowledge to explain why that might be the case. Now you can also argue that perhaps their purpose is slightly different here. That, it starts with, what is our campaign? What is our campaign about? So it's like source B is trying to justify their campaign. And again, if you know anything about the Votes for Women movement, you will know that in 1913 there was a lot. This was the period of militancy, and there was a lot of anti-suffrage feeling around, and the anti-suffrage league, for example, was very powerful. So this is almost a defence, isn't it? What is our campaign about? There's an explanation of what they're doing. So there is no way you can get all of this into an answer, but you can see how what on the face of it may seem to be two quite similar sources. Once you start looking at the tone, the message, the nature, the audience, the origin, all of these things, you will find some differences. And I want to repeat again, all the time looking to bring in the contextual knowledge. If you don't have any of this, you are limiting yourselves to the very lowest bounds of the mark scheme. Talking of which, here it is. Here is the mark scheme. So for the top level, you need to show a sophisticated understanding of the sources and knowledge and understanding of the development of the campaign for the votes for women over time and the different reasons for supporting it. So they're asking for detailed own knowledge here to produce a fully developed response to explain the similarities and differences between them. Okay, so you can read over that in your own time, but you can see it's not easy to get to that top band. The difference here, a sound understanding of the sources and knowledge and understanding. But it's the same thing, they're still looking for similarities and differences between the sources. Lower down, some understanding of the sources, and some knowledge and understanding of the campaign, a basic response by comparing the two sources. So even at this stage, there still needs to be that sense of similarities or differences. You are comparing the two sources. Lower down again, limited knowledge and understanding of the campaign. They interpret the sources, so you might say, well, source A is saying this, source B is saying this, but very limited actual comparison and even worse at level 1, but we're not concerned about those. This is where we want to be